So, have you ever done anything that you wished you had never done? Sometimes tiny, insignificant things blow up and become real issues. So that's kind of one of the themes we'll be talking about today. So today's session on stories from the Vedas is part 2 of Pariksit, Sukadeva, and the Bhagavatam. So we have in this picture here Sukadeva in the blue skin on the Vyasasan. Pariksit is kneeling before him. And the Bhagavatam is what's being spoken by them. So we are Stories from the Vedas every Thursday here at 7 o'clock at 26 2nd Avenue, which is 26 2nd Avenue and East 1st Street. We have a program usually about 30 minutes to an hour, hour and a half sometimes, but I'm really trying to keep it on the narrow side these days. So we're going to see if I can keep it within 30 minutes today. We'll see how that goes, or somewhere thereabouts. So this is the YouTube channel known as Krishna Was Up, KRISHNA WAZZUP. That's the name of the channel. And every Thursday here at 26 2nd Avenue at East 1st Street. So, with that out of the way, this is what I hope to talk about today. We're going to discuss a few different issues here. The first one is that Pariksit was cursed. Last week we spoke a little bit about the Bhagavatam itself, and we spoke about Pariksit, and we spoke about Vyasadeva, and we spoke about Vyasadeva's son Sukadeva, who will be teaching Pariksit. But today our focus will be mostly on Pariksit. Forgetting to put on the pop screen. Because later on, every time I make a P, it goes. And so, all right, so now we're back in business again. So we're going to talk about Pariksit. Last week we talked about Sukadeva, we talked about Vyasadeva, and we talked a little bit about the Bhagavatam. But this time we're going to talk specifically about Pariksit Maharaj, and about why he was cursed to die in 7 days and what that means in general to spiritual life and what it meant in the Bhagavatam and how it fits into our overall story. So these are the topics I hope to go over today: the 10 subject matters of Bhagavatam, the regal line of Pariksit, Parikit's timeline, his particular life, what happened, and we're going to zoom in and focus on the fact that he was cursed by a small boy whose name was Shringi, who was the son of a yogi or a sage. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the themes and of this story of Pariksit and his discussion known as Bhagavatam, and of course his death. And then we're going to talk a little bit again about what is the Bhagavatam itself. And I have to always put this addition here in, but science explains everything. So why are we talking about these mythological stories from ancient India? Who believes those things? Just people who are superstitious muffin heads, I guess. So let's move ahead here. This is the first verse of the 10th chapter of 2nd Canto. Atro sargo visargascha stanam poshanam Uttaya manvantar ishanu kata nirodho muktir ashraya. Sukadeva Goswami said, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 10 divisions of statements regarding the following. The creation of the universe, that's what Sargo is. Subcreation, which is Visargo. and Stanam is the planetary systems. Poshanam is the protection of the Lord. Uttaya is the creative impetus. Manvantara is the change of the Manus. Ishanukata, that's the talks about the Supreme Lord. And Nirodho is the destruction or the wrapping up of the universe. Muktir is liberation, and Ashraya is the summum bonum, or the highest good, or the highest thing, which is, of course, Krishna. So these are the 10 subject matters. The Bhagavatam is a Purana, so it covers these 10 subjects. And these 10 subjects are the main topics of Srimad Bhagavatam. It does not move through them sequentially. It kind of interweaves them from one thing to another, and then at the very end of it, we get the entire Bhagavatam. So I'm trying to give everyone an understanding of what we mean by Bhagavatam and what we mean by this discussion, why this discussion was important at all. So to understand Bhagavatam, first of all, we can understand the people who are the primary people doing the discussion in Bhagavatam, which is Pariksit and Sukadeva. And of course, Sukadeva is the son of Vyasadeva, who wrote all the Vedas. And so we'll move ahead here to the next item here, which is Parikit's regal line. So Pariksit was in a line of kings, and we have the story that Vichitravirya was a younger king who was actually felled by the disease of tuberculosis when he was very young. He had 2 queens, but he didn't have the time yet to have any children by them. So as a result, Vichitravirya did not have any descendants. He had 2 queens, Ambika and Ambalika. And so the idea went that someone else in the family, who was Vyasadeva himself, would be the father of children through these 2 queens of Vichitravirya, who were now widowed. So the first child was Dhritarashtra, who was born blind, so he was not to be accepted as a king. Then the second child was Pandu, who actually did become the king. And the third child was actually not from one of the 2 queens, but from one of their servants, and that child was Vidura, who we talked about a couple of sessions ago. So these 3, Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura, were a part of the royal line in one sense or another. Vidura was actually not counted as royalty, even though he was begotten by Vyasadeva. He was not begotten by one of the queens, so therefore he was not really considered royalty. Now we have the story that Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura. Dhritarashtra should have been the king, but because he was blind, he couldn't accept the role of being the king. And instead, Pandu became the king. And then both Pandu and his wives, as well as Dhritarashtra and his wife, were expecting children. And each were hoping that they would have the first children. Of course, according to the way that the line went in those times, the children of Pandu were destined to become the actual rulers, not the sons of Dhritarashtra, because Dhritarashtra wasn't the ruler. But at any rate, Dhritarashtra hoped that he would have children first, and that might give him the opportunity to have his children. Even though he couldn't be king, his children could be king. However, that's not what happened. Instead, Pandu and his wife, Kunti, they had children first. So Kunti had the 5 Pandavas, or actually 3 of them, and then her co-wife, Madri, had 2 of the Pandavas. And therefore, this X'd out Dhritarashtra's hope that his children would be the next rulers. However, he didn't really give up that hope. And his children went on to also cling very tenaciously to that hope to try to push the Pandavas out of the picture. That's a whole story in itself, which we're not going to cover. That's outside the scope of this particular explanation. So the Pandavas then, they had children themselves, and Arjuna had a son named Abhimanyu. And Abhimanyu then had a wife, Uttara. Abhimanyu was killed in the battle of Kurukshetra. And his child, Abhimanyu and Uttara's child, after the battle of Kurukshetra was over, Abhimanyu was deceased, so the child was still in Uttara's womb. But Uttara discovered that there was an attempt to kill the child. And this was Pariksit. So Pariksit was yet unborn in the womb of Uttara. And Ashvatthama, as vengeance against the Pandavas for winning the battle of Kurukshetra, wanted to destroy all of them. So he sent a Brahmastra weapon to destroy all the Pandavas. It failed to destroy the Pandavas, but he reorganized or redirected the weapon towards the womb of Uttara, so at least it would destroy their last remaining descendant, who was Pariksit, who was in the womb. And when the Brahmastra weapon struck Pariksit in the womb, the Supreme Lord protected him. Although he should have been killed and his body was destroyed, the Supreme Lord saved him and created a new body for Pariksit. And he was not killed. But this gave Pariksit the opportunity to see the Supreme Lord while he was yet unborn in the womb. And then when Pariksit came out of the womb after he was born, he always looked at everyone and everything, thinking, will I see the same person again? Will I see Krishna again? Of course, Pariksit would not see Krishna again. Krishna had already left the planet by the time Pariksit was born. So Yudhisthira was overjoyed that at least there was one descendant of their line. Everybody on Dhritarashtra's side was killed, all of his 100 sons that he had. So after the Battle of Kurukshetra, the Kuru line on the Dhritarashtra side was finished. And on the other side, on the Pandava side, almost everyone was finished except for the Pandavas themselves and Pariksit. So Pariksit was the last remaining descendant who was to take the throne after the Pandavas would give up the throne themselves. So Yudhisthira, there's a whole section in Bhagavatam. We're right in that section right now, around the 13th chapter of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where it discusses how happy Yudhisthira was that Pariksit was not killed. Then, after Krishna leaves the planet, some time shortly thereafter, then the Pandavas also decide it's time for them to leave the planet. They know Kali Yuga is coming, and they leave the entire kingdom in the hands of Pariksit, their one remaining descendant, and they themselves take off on a death march into the Himalayas, where they give up their bodies. During the time that Pariksit is administering the kingdom, he is so expert that even though the age of Kali Yuga is supposed to start, the age of Kali Yuga cannot start because of the presence of Pariksit. He's able to push back Kali Yuga. And he meets Kali personified and keeps Kali from being able to infiltrate and undermine the entire world morality. However, we're going to discuss in a minute, he was cursed. And when Pariksit was cursed, he knew he only had 7 days to live, so he decided to take those last 7 days and to do something important with that time. He wanted to know what was the purpose of life. Of course, we all want to know that, and we all should know that. What is the meaning of life? It makes no difference when we die, whether we die with $1 million or we die with 5 cents. when we die, we have to leave it behind, whatever it was. Others may be able to enjoy our legacy, but we will not. We will move on. Nobody takes anything with them, not their reputation, not their money. And nobody dies on their deathbed wishing they'd spent more time in the office, wishing that they'd made a few more dollars, wishing that they were just a little more famous than they are. Generally, people don't die with that idea in their mind. So what is the purpose of life? And this is what Pariksit asked the sages at Naimisharanya. So, not the sages at Naimisharanya, this is what Pariksit asked the sages at the Ganges, where he was giving up his body. So they gave him different answers, and finally Sukadeva Goswami stepped forward and became the main person who would answer Parikit's questions. So in 7 days, Pariksit heard this Srimad Bhagavatam, this explanation of what is life about, what is the purpose of our existence, and how we can best utilize that existence that we have. And then after the 7 days are over, Pariksit is killed. The mystical snake that was supposed to kill him kills him, and he bursts into flames, and that's the end of Pariksit. But Pariksit has a son, Janmejaya, who carries on after him. All right, so this is a brief overview of Parikit's life history. Now we're going to talk about the story of how he was cursed. We're going to zoom in on that part. Wow, today I am so dry. All right, so the story we have here is that Pariksit goes hunting in the forest. This is better seen on this picture. And when he hunts in the forest, he becomes thirsty. And he looks around for water and he can't find it, but he sees a hut, a hermitage, where there's a sage who is living there. So he goes into the hut of the sage, and the sage is in the process of meditation. The sage is not making any motion. And the king asks the sage for some water, but because the sage is deep in meditation, he's completely oblivious to the king being in the hut. And Pariksit is disturbed by this. He just wishes he could have some water. And as a kind of an insult, there was a dead snake outside the hut. And so Pariksit picks up the snake with a horn of his bow and places it like a sort of farcical garland around the shoulders of the sage. The sage has no awareness of any of this going on. And then Pariksit leaves. Now, what happens after that is that, as we say, Pariksit goes hunting in the forest, Pariksit becomes tired and thirsty, enters the sage's hut. In frustration, he wraps a dead snake around the sage's shoulders. Then this is the sage's son named Shringi, who feels that Pariksit has insulted his father. In fact, in one sense, who can doubt that Pariksit has insulted his father? However, two things we should know is that this was very out of character for Pariksit. Generally, he was much more self-controlled than this. He was not someone that was a flighty, egotistical person. He was just caught in the frustration of the moment. And as we see, this was all intended to be this kind of out-of-character mock insult to the sage by putting a snake around his shoulders. And so the son said, "Who does this king think he is? He is a king, but we are sages. We are higher than the king. So why does he try to insult my father in this way? I will show you my power." And he used his little bit of power that he got as a brahmana to produce a curse on Maharaj Pariksit. And the curse would be that Maharaj Pariksit would die within 7 days from the bite of a snake bird. So this was the curse uttered against Pariksit. And later on, after he made this boast before his friends, his father found out about it. And his father wondered why, when he came out of meditation, there was a snake wrapped around him, but he didn't pay much attention to it. Then, of course, his son filled him in that Pariksit had come and been disturbed by the fact that the sage didn't offer him any water and put the snake around his shoulders. And the sage himself considered this a trifling thing and was angry at his son for having produced this very shocking and lethal curse against probably one of the best kings that they had at that time. So Pariksit was certainly very important to the way things were running. And the sage took his son, and they went to Pariksit, and he said, "My son is sorry for this curse, and I am very sorry that he did this curse. Just counteract it. You are powerful. You can counteract this curse, and it will not affect you." But Pariksit actually felt shamed. He understood that he had acted out of character, and he felt that the curse was fitting, that he should die as a result of this gesture of insult to the sage. So he refused to retract the curse, and therefore he gave up his kingdom, and he went to the Ganges to fast until his death, because he knew the terms of the curse were that he would die in 7 days. So during those 7 days, Pariksit sat at the Ganges, and there he heard Srimad Bhagavatam, this discourse on the nature and purpose of human life. This discourse on how bhakti works, this discourse on who the Supreme Personality of Godhead really is, and why we just need to worship the Supreme. We do not need to pay any attention to demigods or follow any other processes that are aimed at some kind of material benediction. So here are some themes in this story of Pariksit that are interesting to take a look at. And we won't get into them too deeply here, but I think they're important to focus in on at least a little bit. So one of the themes is that we see from the story that we just went through today that Pariksit was saved by Krishna in the womb when there was a Brahmastra thrown against him when he was yet unborn. And he sees the Supreme Lord who saves him in the womb. But Pariksit was unwilling to ask the Supreme Lord to protect him in this case, because he felt actually that he had transgressed himself. So he felt that the curse was fitting, and he didn't use his own power, nor did he ask the Supreme Lord for protection. He simply accepted the curse. We may wonder why he would do this, but of course, there was a very high sense of honor in those times, and that if someone who was a political leader made some inappropriate thing, they felt more than they felt it was very important to somehow make up for it. And this is what he felt was the proper thing. And he felt that he hadn't come up with this curse, and it was coming his way, so why should he try to counteract it? From a larger perspective, and we'll talk about this in a minute when we talk about resignation to fate. Actually, we'll talk about it right now. So there was a larger thing here, which we sometimes call fate. Now, usually the concept of fate, when we talk about it, refers to karma. That when a person goes through life, they rack up plus points and negative points. when they perform actions that are beneficial and helpful to others, when they follow the directives of the Vedic injunctions, they get plus points, and therefore in the future lives they will enjoy. And similarly, when people perform hateful, obnoxious actions and harm others, then they're performing vikarma, which will give them negative points, and they'll have to suffer as a result of those in the future. And so therefore, we see that there's a fire on a street and one building burns and the building next door to the building doesn't burn, but the building on the other side burns as well. So we wonder how and why is this possible? And this is because it isn't just raw material formulas and principles at work. There's the principle of karma. So karma is like a wind that forces things to play out in a particular way. And this is what was happening here. But now we're talking about fate on a higher level. So generally when we talk about fate, we're talking about somebody's individual karma. But outside the law of karma is the Supreme Lord, Krishna himself. So he's beyond the karma, and he's the maintainer and creator of the karmic system. And sometimes he sets aside karma. And sometimes he creates circumstances where it appears that somebody is getting some karma, but actually Krishna is using that karma only as a pretext for something that he wants to engineer. So Krishna wanted the Bhagavatam to be spoken. And for it to be spoken, there had to be a very monumental event to make it very important, very prescient, very dramatic. So the best way to make it dramatic was to have this event where the king, who everybody loved and respected and was very potent and powerful and very beneficial, to have this king cursed. And then in 7 days this king would hear Bhagavatam and change his life and then die. So we would not be talking about it today if this had not occurred. So Krishna needed to engineer this setting. As I say, this, insult against the sage was not really in character of Maharaja Pariksit, but nevertheless, this became the motivating or the generating principle that caused this chain of events to happen. And Pariksit subconsciously understood that this was a larger plan. It wasn't him really getting his karma. This was far more severe than his karma would have ordained ordinarily. But he was being used as the vehicle to make a big stamp on the collective understanding, on the collective philosophy of the world. And Krishna wanted this stamp made. He wanted the Bhagavatam to be heard. He wanted it to be heard in a setting which would call attention to it. So this is why we were talking about these things, fate and the nature of fate. Usually fate just means karma, but in this case, fate means the plan of the Supreme. So another theme here in the Pariksit story is that sometimes something very insignificant winds up turning out to have severe repercussions. So we should really think twice before we do things, because it's easy to not do something than it is to have to undo the effects afterwards. If you break a pot, how do you put the pot back together? If you take a piece of paper and you tear it in a million pieces and throw it to the wind, can you go retrieve all those pieces and put it back? You cannot. So we have to try to live in a very sattvic or mode of goodness way and understand how what we do affects others. And that way we won't do things which we're later sorry for. Pariksit was sorry, and he felt that this curse of the young boy was actually appropriate. Of course, from another point of view, this young boy Shringi was an agent of Kali. the worst of the four ages, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali. So Kali is the worst of the ages. And it's an age where people are degraded, where their motives are base, where people are not interested in spiritual life, where people are very materialistic and atheistic. This is the nature of our age. And Kali is here as a unifying and a directing factor to blow people in this direction. And one of the first people to be used as an instrument by Kali Yuga was this Shringi, who was the instrument who would pervert and degrade the Brahminical community. And later they would become far more degraded than that. But this would enter into the Brahminical community, and he would be used as the agency by which Pariksit would be killed and moved off the scene. So that's another theme here. Another theme is the childish pride and ego strips the earth of an amazing king, that, sometimes some silly, childish motivation of a single individual deprives the world of some good thing in a larger scope. And the other main important idea here in the Pariksit story, there are many important, but I'm just choosing these 6 as the most important that I see right off the top. Any day may be our last. So Pariksit was in the prime of life. He was the king. He was not an old man. He was not ready to retire. But he took this last 7 days and used it to perfect his life. Do we have 7 days left to live? We don't know. We may not. So any day may be our last. Therefore, we should live our life trying to understand what the real purpose of life actually might be. So finally, I'll end with this section on, the Bhagavatam. So what is it really? It's an elaboration of 10 subjects we just talked about at the beginning. It's the story of Sukadeva and Pariksit. That's another explanation of what Bhagavatam is. It's an expansion of the Vedanta Sutra, which was written before the Bhagavatam, which was very short, and it was supposed to be the summary of the entire Bhagavatam, of the entire Vedas, I'm sorry. And after Vedanta Sutra was written, Vedavyas felt it was too inscrutable, so he expanded it further back again into a larger volume, which was called the Srimad Bhagavatam. And it's an explanation of spiritual life by Vyasadeva. That's what Bhagavatam is. It's also an explanation of the Vedas by Vyasadeva. So the Bhagavatam is the cream, the source, the crux of the Vedas by Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva wrote all the Vedas. But Bhagavatam's actually the real bottom line and what's most important. If you never read the Vedas but you read Bhagavatam, you haven't really missed out on anything. If you've read all the rest of the Vedas but you haven't read Bhagavatam, you've missed out big time. So it's the cream of the Vedas. It's Vyasadeva's attempt to spotlight bhakti, because in the other Vedas, many other processes are highlighted in various places, and one can easily come away with the idea that all of them are the same, and we can do jnana, we can do yoga, we can do karma, whatever we feel inclined to, all paths go to the same place. This is not so. Krishna says so in the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. But here in Bhagavatam, we see that Vyasadeva is spotlighting bhakti. He does not eulogize any of these other processes in Srimad Bhagavatam, only bhakti. And also Vyasadeva spotlights Krishna, which he did not do. Of course, Krishna is there in all the Vedas, but in Bhagavatam, he's the key figure, the central figure all the way along. He's not a minor figure like he appears to be in some of the other Vedas. So he also narrates Krishna's pastimes. There's 90 chapters in the 10th canto. It's the largest of all the cantos. And that's what we hear in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. And of course, it's the basics of how to escape the material world, passed down from time immemorial, set into writing. The Bhagavatam had been spoken from guru to disciple way before even Vyasadeva. And so it's been going on since time immemorial, a guru speaking it to the disciple. So it was done in many forms, always in a verbal form. But with Kali Yuga coming on, it was obvious that people's minds would not be able to grasp long philosophical explanations anymore. So they had to have a short and written explanation, because we can't remember large tracts of information, so we have to have it written down. And that's what Vyasadev's contribution was. He took the Vedas from a verbal form to a written form. All right, so finally, I just wanted to wrap up with this, that we can imagine that in our modern world, many people, probably many of people watching this YouTube, can feel like, well, why do we care about these superstitious mythological stories from ancient writings? Snake birds and people dying in 7 days and, all this kind of thing. What's this got to do with the modern world? We know this kind of stuff doesn't exist, but does it not exist? So we hear these kind of things all the time, but science explains everything. Science is based on facts, and those facts are repeatable. Religion is only based on faith. Science is based on facts, religion is based on faith. Sounds like a great shibboleth, but actually it's false. Science is also based on faith. And science certainly does know certain facts very directly and very concretely, but we can always ask the question, are these laws that the scientists study, are these principles that the scientists give us, are they always and everywhere? Or are there maybe some exceptions to these principles at certain times in certain places? Is there a scientific experiment we can do to prove that? You can always prove a positive very easily. Like if you say, are there white swans? All I have to do is bring you one white swan and I've proved my point. But if I ask you, are there swans that are not white? You can bring me one white one, two white ones, 100 white ones, 1,000,000 white ones, and it still doesn't prove the fact that there might be other colors of swans. Indeed, there are other colors of swans. So what we've been discussing at other times is that this material energy is an energy. It works in a certain way. It follows these principles that scientists examine. But since these are energies of God, after all, then at any time, the Supreme Lord can bypass any of these energies and their normal functionings and do something else. And we call that, in our modern vocabulary, we call that miracles or magic or whatever you want to call it. But this field of things does exist. And there's some who will poo-poo this because they've never actually seen something that brought them to the edge of what material science explains. They've never seen the universe do these kind of things. Okay, I can understand the skepticism. But in fact, the universe does do these things. And if you're a yogi or you're a demigod, you can play with what we call material reality the same way that people in a virtual reality play with digital programming and can cause anything they want to appear on the screen. So in a similar way, the demigods and yogis are able to control reality at a different level. What to speak of the Supreme Lord, who's in charge of the entire thing. So you can prove some things, at least you can prove them as many times as you want, like proving another white swan. But there's certain phenomenon that does not obey our command and show yourself demands. We can command that some particular phenomenon show itself, but if that phenomenon is beyond our reach, then there's no reason that it has to show itself at our challenge. So at any rate, these kind of things go on, but thinking people will start to wonder that is it that all these things that we hear in our everyday world, ghosts, UFOs, karma, reincarnation, out-of-the-body experiences, are these things just imagination? Are all these people duped? It is certainly no doubt that there is a certain amount of people who use these things as a mechanism for making money or for bamboozling others. Does that mean that everybody's doing it? You could say the same thing for science. People use science also to bamboozle others. So at any rate, I'm going to end here. We're 10 minutes over. I did 40 minutes instead of 30. But at any rate, do you have any questions? If you do, there's a microphone right there. Please use the microphone.
Hare Krishna. Now, what power did Pariksit have to hold back Kali Yuga?
Pariksit was a righteous king. He was a devotee. So he had both physical power and spiritual power as well. Kings cannot be weaklings. They have to be people who are physically powerful as well. And he has to also understand morality at a deep level, because kings can't just be arbitrary. I mean, in the modern world, that's why kings are no longer accepted anywhere in the world, because they have neither spiritual power nor a real depth of understanding of morality. They're just people in some kind of family line and nothing more, as we see with the recent abdication of one prince. So an actual king is supposed to understand morality. An actual king is supposed to be self-controlled. An actual king is supposed to be physically powerful. In fact, in India, it used to be that a prince had to prove himself by fighting a tiger hand to hand, with just a dagger. So if he could do that, then he was considered that he was a worthy person to take the next step, and become king. So when a person actually understands Vedic knowledge, when a person actually follows Vedic knowledge, they carry with them a force, This is like, that kind of crazy thing that they talk about in Star Wars, the Force or whatever it is. But the Force is the force of the Supreme Lord. When someone's in harmony with the rules that the Supreme Lord is actually putting forward in the world, then such a person can do amazing things, because actually he has at his beck and call the full energy and power of the Supreme Lord. And in this way, such a person can do all kinds of amazing things. So that's kind of how I would answer your question. Okay, so thank you all very much. Again, this is Stories from the Vedas. We're here every Thursday. Today is Thursday, November 21st. Sukadeva, Pariksit, and the Bhagavatam. Next week, we're not going to have a Stories from the Vedas session. Instead, we will have a session from What's Up With That. We'll be discussing the paranormal, particularly UFOs from a Vedic perspective. That's what's on tap for next week on November 28th. So the website, not the website, but the YouTube channel is Krishna Was Up, KRISHNAWAZZUP. Here is 26 2nd Avenue at 26 at 2nd Avenue and East 1st Street. So thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.